Wow, that was a long introduction. I got nothing to add on that one, except, and Kamala, thank you as well. I remember being introduced. I love to talk to inner city kids. And I remember somebody gave me a bit of a long introduction. So I said, I got good news and bad news. The bad news is the guy you just introduced can't make it, but you got me. Well, some of that stuff does apply, I guess all of it, but I must tell you, I really like to give back whatever I can in knowledge and experience back to good people like Peter and Kamala and you people on the audience, because I think part of our responsibility is not only to learn, but most of all to give back. And so please appreciate that. That's overly long, and as always, Peter, thank you. You and I have been co-conspirators or whatever, different things. Okay. So you got the story about, I've been around a long time, so I've achieved some things. I come from a humble background. My dad was an Irish immigrant. He died when I was 11. My mother was handicapped. She had very bad lungs. She had scarlet fever as a youth. And so I went to work when I was 12 to support my mother. My two brothers were away in college. I'm proud to tell you that my father and mother raised 3 boys and a girl, and the 3 boys all got doctorates. My sister didn't get a doctorate, but she was probably the smartest of all of us. Long story short, we worked very, very hard. And I will tell you one more story about my background. I went to Cornell. I got a full scholarship. I'll never let Cornell forget it. So I'm very active at Cornell. I love that school. I love the fact that it's need blind. So if you apply and you're accepted, you're going, no matter what your financial status. But when I decided I wanted to go to law school, I had no money. So I decided to go to law school anyway. And I worked 57 hours a week, went full-time to law school at St. John's, and I'm very proud of that, because I then became an M&A attorney and had a dozen lawyers working for me doing deals around the world. Okay, enough of all that, wonderful, and you've heard all the flowers and all that stuff. And you know what? I wouldn't be anything close to, reasonably knowledgeable as I am today without failing. And I failed a few times, for sure. And I'm going to talk to you about those because there are lessons in ethics. And I want to talk to you exactly what happened there. And then I'm going to give you some lessons at least I learned. And then, of course, Melanie and Kamala are going to give you far more brilliant observations about, moral guidelines. But my best friend, forgive me, is Jesus Christ. And so I really believe that we have a responsibility to take care of people. And I will tell you one more thing about me. I have to use the word I today a lot. I don't like that word. I like the word we. I don't like the word they. I like the word us. And frankly, I think that's the attitude and spirit that every company should be made of. So, okay, where have I failed and what have I learned? Let me tell you about one company. I had a client. Did very well in Greenwich, Connecticut, a very high income type place. And one of my clients was a real giant. He founded the Limited with Les Wexner. He said, let's go buy a company that has a great name, and we'll build a very large sporting goods apparel company that will compete with Columbia. Columbia's a big player in the sporting good apparel, fishing and relaxing, etc. So we bought a company, and I'll tell you its name. Forgive me, I'm sorry. I didn't realize this is on. And I don't know if I need to tell you the name, but we bought a company. It was run by a guy named Jim. And Jim and I really hit it off right off the bat. He was an Irishman. And I remember him saying to my wife one time, God, I love Kevin. I never forget what my wife said. Yeah, you'll love him all the way as long as you live by your numbers. You better keep your numbers. You don't keep your numbers, and suddenly Kevin's not the most fun guy in the world, which is true of me. I'm a real numbers guy. So Jim says to me, he says, I thank you for your investment with this big deal from the Limited, and I'm going to appoint the CFO. I said, no, you're not. We have a substantial investment, and I really believe you should carry the purse strings. You can hire the internal CFO, but I'm going to hire the accounting firm. He said, okay. So we hired John, let's call it John, as a CFO. And I like to, when we make an investment early on, we keep our nose in, but our hands out. We don't want to interfere with day to day, but I like to have a weekly meeting and a dashboard of what's happened this week, both quantitatively and qualitatively, what's happened with the company. So I like to have a, no more than an hour meeting, hopefully 45 minutes. What's going on? So basically one of the key headlines is he said, we're hiring this accounting firm. I said, remember, Jim, I told you I was going to hire the accounting firm. He said, oh, I have some great candidates locally in Florida. At that time, I was up in Connecticut, New York. I said, no, I'll be hiring a New York firm. Okay. And that's, thank God I did. Okay. So long story short, we finished, it was, we were going through a software conversion in the company where John, the CFO, was in charge of that. And this is several years ago. So software conversions then was more difficult than it is now, but that doesn't change the story. So John goes through that, and every week, it's amazing. I'm getting these dashboard financials that just seem to be very, very close to our business plan, despite the fact that the industry is taking a hit. This is, you can guess the period of time, about 10 years ago, and whenever the Great Recession, and the industry is taking a hit. It's down 30, 40%, but amazingly, our sales are holding up. And as I found out later, we wanted to do some clothing, and he wanted me to raise more capital for clothing. And so it was really good results. So my accountant in New York goes down there to meet with John, the financial guy, and Jim, the CEO. And he calls me up. He's down in Florida, and he says to me, he says, Kev, he says, I don't know why, but John, he's shaking like a leaf. I told him I was coming here 2 weeks ago, and he's not prepared. And he wants me to come back in a few weeks. I'm a little concerned. I guess I should fly back to New York. I said, no, I'm flying down. So I flew down to Florida, and we spent a day, maybe a day and a half. And I realized that the numbers that I was given on a weekly basis were not the accurate numbers of the company. I wasn't sure what the accurate numbers are, but it was clear based upon inventory and what was being sold and accounts receivable that there's no way that sales were as depicted to me, as described to me on a relatively constant basis, week to week. So I walked into the CEO's office, Jim, and I said, John has been misinforming us of the financials. What is your knowledge of this? Oh, I knew that he was a co-conspirator. However, I had to be pragmatic. I had a lot of friends as investors, and I had to make sure that the company survived their corruption. So he says to me, he says, it must be the CFO, but I really don't want you to get rid of him. He's very important to me, et cetera. I said, well, why don't you join me if you like, because I'm going out there and firing him right now. It's up to you to join me. So I went out and fired the CFO, and I told the accountant I need him to stay on for a few days and then to help us through a transition. During that transition, and this was right after, literally, we sold Sobe, S-O-B-E. Thank you, Peter. It wasn't S-O-B. Sobe was the most successful, fastest growing beverage company. We were on the cover of Time magazine. So, I'm Mr. Universe. Well, this is only 8 months after Mr. Universe was Mr. Time magazine. And now I had a $10 million line that Merrill Lynch gave me on a handshake because I was so close to the boys at Merrill. And I had a $10 million personal guarantee on a company that I now realized was pretty much in trouble. $10 million then, 12, 14 years ago, was a lot more than it is today. And that's a lot of money. I don't care who you are, what you are, or whatever. Fortunately, there was a chief operating officer that did have integrity. And I got to know him, and I took him out to dinner, one-on-one. Then I started communicating with him almost every night around 10 p.m. And I gave him a bonus for that. I said, I need, let's call him Joe. Joe, I need your insights on this company. I needed to have something. Now, you may say, well, why didn't you get rid of the CEO, Jim, right away? I couldn't. He was the business. He was known for the business, and everybody knew Jim as part of that business. So I had to be very, very careful not to destroy the business and all of the employees that were counting on it for a livelihood. But I thought I could trust Joe. And as it turned out, I could. And he was telling me when Jim, the CEO, was lying to me each day or whatever. So now I had to say, I'm going to have to approve every penny that's spent by this company, every penny. I don't care if the check is for $25. So I became literally involved in everything involved in the company. And it was a very difficult time. I was losing a lot of sleep. But I was working with the CEO. And so we started turning it around. And so I sought out some investors or acquirers. One of the competitors in the industry, I got to know the CEO. I spent some time with lunch with him, built a relationship. And I really believe in relationships on every level, like a Peter and like folks on this call. And so, I developed a relationship with them and they said, okay, we'll buy you out. And the amount that they buy us out would make my company whole with the bank. It wouldn't necessarily make it whole with the investors. And up at that point, and I don't remember any other time since, my investors would lose their money if I did this deal, but at least we'd come out in no bankruptcy. I don't remember another deal that my investors didn't make some money on something that we put in, that I brought people in, but I did learn a lesson on it, okay? And I'll tell you that in a second. So long story short, we turned it around to such an extent that we got what we invested as a purchase price, and we were about to go to closing. And Jim, about a week before closing, says, he says, I want a special bonus because I've been sticking around. And I want a stay bonus because I want a contract for a year or two after closing. And he thought he had a gun to my head. And frankly, sometimes you reach a certain point, and believe me, I don't want to work with anybody who's dishonest, but sometimes you just have to work a little bit to work out a good result for many people, not just me, but for the employees, et cetera. So I've had enough. And I said, Jim, you're fired. I don't want to have anything to do with you. You're such a bad person. I'll take the hit, whatever I got to do next week. And then I called up the potential buyer and I spoke to the CEO. And there's not one embellishment here. This is an absolutely true story. And I called him and I said, look, adverse material change. I fired Jim. And I just want you to know that. And I just don't feel that he has the integrity to move forward. And I just don't want him to continue with the company, whether with me or with you. And I'll never forget the buyer said to me, he said, thank God, we didn't like him at all. And we were going to fire him right after we bought the company. So we proceeded to sell that company. Now we took some risks and we did have to keep cool, but it turned out to be okay. All right. Second and last example. I really believe in clean water. It's one of my passions, along with orphan children. I spent a lot of time on clean water and orphan children, and I built a very interesting company. Our initial company created the Pure filter for Procter & Gamble, and I wanted to create a filter that would work for people around the world that was much more powerful and much more effective than Pure. Long story short, my travels brought me to Nigeria. And I spoke at the water conference in front of the president of Nigeria and many ministers from some African countries. The day after I spoke, the vice president of Nigeria asked me to come to the White House. The meeting was in Abuja, which is the capital of Nigeria. And he said, we have a new election about a year from now. So I could tell there was a political purpose here. But we want you to bring your filters to Nigeria. I said, I can't bring filters to Nigeria unless I know what the conditions are, because you have to retrofit the filter to the conditions. As I found out, southwest Nigeria has severe arsenic, which causes cancer, and northeast Nigeria has a lot of fluoride, which causes all sorts of issues. Long story short, I said, look, we got to do a water map of Nigeria. It'll be very valuable to you anyway. He said, well, what would that cost? I said, it'll cost, we have to do lab testing, and we have to do it in each of your 36 states or provinces. They have 36 of them, at least they did in Nigeria at the time. And it'll cost about $3 million. We're not making a profit in that first phase, but then you have a map and we have a map and we can work together. He said, go, we are committed. I am the vice president. Here's the chief economic advisor to the president. He apologizes he can't make it. We are a go. Nigeria is a go. So I sent a budget, and the budget had $3 million first phase. Didn't hear back. So finally, I got a hold of a lawyer in DC who was doing a lot of business in Nigeria, and he went to the finance minister. The finance minister said, oh, yeah, we liked Kevin a lot. He was fabulous. But when he said the first phase would require $18 million, we just thought that was inconsistent with his presentation. The fact of the matter is that the vice president and whoever else was involved, we're going to take a $15 million consideration for bringing us into this deal. I will tell you that bribery is more present than ever. We've done business in 80 countries. We continue to do it around the world. And constantly, we see politicians looking for advances more than they're entitled to and more than reasonable so that they can pad. I love the expression, one of the head guys in Mexico once said, I want you to contribute to my family foundation. Uh-huh. How much? Oh, $3 million. You're such a kindred spirit. Now, we are morally bound not to give that. No one on this call should be doing that. But as Americans, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was passed in 1977. And if an American gives away any bribery, we go to jail in this country. So basically, anybody that receives or gives a bribe has a gun to their head. So there's a moral reason, the strongest of all, and there's also a legal reason. Okay, so what lessons did we learn? Here are the lessons that we learned at McGovern in my family office, and I don't expect you to agree with all of it, but it's fine. We deal with family offices rather than politicians. Politicians are wonderful, some are wonderful, but politicians come and go, and good families in countries typically stick around. So we like to deal with family offices, and that's why I speak at a lot of family office conferences like this. Make sure when you're making an investment or involved, have a direct relationship with those who control the purse strings of your companies that you invest in, et cetera. Good leaders are not good managers typically. So make sure you always meet the outside person, the mouth, the chief passion officer, and make sure you meet the inside person that's counting your pennies. Initially, I really believe nose in, hands out makes sense until there's a crisis or until there's an inconsistency. Inconsistencies almost always are the tip of the iceberg. When we're investing, we look for inconsistencies on the part of the people in the company with respect to others in the industry that we talk to. Inconsistencies are often the tip of the iceberg. Success often breeds corruption, and you just got to know that you got to keep an eye on a company every step of the way, even when it's successful. So basically, our guidelines is good accounting regulations should be implemented by all, whether countries or when we're making investments. And I turn it over to Peter because good governance prevents corruption, in my opinion. So that's my little story. Thank you for listening. And Peter, I'm sure you have some comments or thoughts, and I'm here to answer any and all questions.
Yes, indeed. Well, look, there's really a plethora of directions I could take with this, but as far as good leaders are not always good managers, perhaps you could elaborate upon that experience and how you came to that conclusion, Kevin. That'd be really intriguing for us, because I've also found that as well.
Mainly the entrepreneurs, when you have a seasoned veteran, Peter, who's been a CEO of many, many companies, it probably doesn't apply as much, okay? But early stage entrepreneurs tend to be people who can stretch the truth a little bit more than most. They tend to be more optimistic than most. And by the way, I do not think that's necessarily a fault. I always look for early stage companies to have what I call a CPO, a chief passion officer. You have to have almost that madman who believes in the company 24/7 and leads everybody else. He or she does not have to be the most brilliant, but they need to be the most passionate. But passion often leads to a little bit of hyperbole. Let's leave it at that. Mm-hmm. So I always want to meet the inside person that says, yeah, I know. John speaks, I better not say John again, but Gene speaks so highly of the company, but there's some reality here. Because, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when you're looking at investments, Peter, you're looking for those, weaknesses and threats more than you're looking at the opportunity. The outside guy has told you all about the opportunity and all about those financials where he's building $1 billion company, but you spend your time on those weaknesses and threats. And the person that usually answers the questions is that inside person. I'm always looking for that inside person who has a dose of greater reality than the CPO.
No, indeed, indeed. Also, as well, you mentioned about meeting the inside person who's controlling the dollars, the CFO, and it's extraordinary. I've just done due diligence on a company, and they did. I met them only for 15 minutes, and they had a new CEO, brilliant man. He was straight, and he was there to turn their company around. I asked those questions, and it all emanated from the dead fish being with the CFO. Same sort of scenario. What do you look for when you're interviewing the CFO and the team initially? Because you're very hands-on, in terms of your due diligence, and you like to meet the people rather than leaving for the accountants and the auditors. So tell us a bit about that process in trying to find those inconsistencies, and when you're questioning or turning over the rocks by being diplomatic in doing so.
I'll break it into two words. I use them too often: micro and macro. There's a micro due diligence that you perform on a company. You're interviewing management. You're looking for inconsistencies in what they say with respect to, do they have equal vision? There should be a shared vision on the part of management. If the management have different ideas of the vision, that's usually a sign of trouble. That means they're probably going to disagree sooner or later on something really significant, and most likely sooner. So you're looking for that. But what I do is I go outside to experts in that industry. We have a motto at McGovern Capital, and you've heard it before, Peter: catch the current, make the wave. But I look for people who understand the current of that industry. And so I'm saying, look, these guys have a vision. They think they're unique. I was literally on the phone an hour ago with one of my key people who said, not unique. They think they're unique. They're not at all unique. So I do macro due diligence on those people to look for inconsistencies with respect to their vision, their plan, and their projections. And so you're always looking for the inconsistencies. Something's not adding up. My favorite word for that, and I co-chaired science at Cornell as a trustee, tech transfer, is scientists love the word iterate, iterate, iterate. Look for straight line through all those pieces of information. And if that straight line, it turns out to be crooked, don't put the investment. And again, the old expression, boy, have I learned it over and over. If it's too good to be true, it is too good to be true. Right, Peter?
Absolutely.
Now, one more thing. When I'm interviewing entrepreneurs have maybe 3, 5, 7 times more bad news than good news. Suddenly you can sell your company for billions or hundreds of millions or whatever. You didn't think about that 2 weeks ago when you had an inventory problem. You look for people who have the fortitude. It's much more than persistence. It's mental fortitude. People say, well, what's your best training? How'd you become an entrepreneur? I said, I was a poor kid, and I was a pretty tough kid. Okay. And I learned that when you get hit by a left hook, you come back with a right cross and you don't go down. You need to find entrepreneurs who have the strength to fight back and take adversity and make it into opportunity. You've heard it 100 times. Those words are easy. The action is not.
No, unequivocally. And we're in a new era, of course, of tech entrepreneurs. A lot of people are seeing all of these almost celebrity entrepreneurs now, as you know. And I'm sort of jumping ahead a few of my questions, but I'll ask you, I may as well jump into this one, because there are international arbitrages in terms of valuations of companies. Okay, I'll give an example, a real one. A company out of Europe was valued in their country at about $30 million. They came to the UK and valued it at $50 million. When they went to America, early stage, the hype, the tech and all that, 150. And of course, so they want to do the raise, get the initial valuation there. Now there's two types. We look for obviously, legitimate companies that are going to make a profit or are already cash flowing. But as you know, of course, you can play the valuation game on companies that may not make a penny for 10 years or essentially just hype. I've seen a lot of people in, of course, some in the family office world did very well in the lockdown period, and others didn't do as well because they invested in the hype companies that got shut down. But as far as, of course, we have a different valuation system in Europe, the Middle East and Asia, for example. They like to see some sort of validation of the numbers. They like to actually see some profit. And also there's a less of a spirit of the entrepreneur. They won't take a bet on that energetic young kid. They want to see a track record of experience before they sign checks. how do you see, number one, the different valuation systems and mindsets of America and globally, and how are you arbitraging that value? Because you're in a prime position where you're right, got all the high valuations at your feet, but how do you keep everyone happy that it's a real business that they're happy with going forward? So I'd love your thoughts on that arbitrage and how you manage that global situation.
The arbitrage is very simple. We learned it in economics 101, risk reward, and if you don't want to take the risk, you probably won't get the type of returns that you want. Probably. Okay. You go in early, you may lose some, you're going to gain some, and your typical returns are going to be greater because you have less at stake. But the bottom line is the valuation game is a whole different, one of the lessons I tell young entrepreneurs is, you may even get family and friends and fools, the 3 F's, mostly fools. You may get people to invest in a high valuation, but it will come back to haunt you. Because say the company really should have an initial valuation of 5 million, but you get investors, the fools, in at 10 million. Well, what happens after a year when your sales are only 500,000 and you need the next round of capital? And more sophisticated investors are needed, and they laugh at your $10 million valuation. And what happens when you need to do a down round? The most important investors in your company in the second round are the attitude of the first round investors. If they are pumping sunshine, maybe they may not write a check, and maybe some will. That's a big test to me of whether I should be putting money in the second round. We typically go in early, but we also go in on the second and third rounds, okay? But if the initial investor, if I meet a person that's got a round already in, I want to meet those investors, and I want to see how happy they are. And if suddenly their valuation is down to 5 million, they're not happy based upon the simple arithmetic that their valuation and their percentage of the company has gone down by a half, and they're going to get diluted more than they even think possible. They're probably not going to write a check, and they're not happy. So it comes back to haunt you. You're not selling. Another thing is, people have a valuation of X and they think they can sell their company for that. Not necessarily. Do not drink your Kool-Aid. That's Kool-Aid, in my opinion. Younger people in this call probably have no idea what the fuck about Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid is a sugary drink that I used to have as a kid. Don't drink your own hype. You can talk to other people about your hype, but don't you drink it. If you raise it around at 10 million, that doesn't mean you own 10%. I'm a millionaire. No, you're not. When you sell it someday, we'll see. It's much easier to gather in, rounds of money than to sell your company for that valuation. Much easier. So be realistic, and in the long run, what's much better? If the first round's at 5 million and the second round is at 10 million, guess what? Your first round of investors will probably take the hunk of the second round. Okay. And the sophisticated investors that you need will buy into it because you're now performing and you didn't have too difficult a scenario to retrofit with on the second round. I hope I'm making sense, but be real to yourself as well as to your investors, and it pays off. And it doesn't just pay off morally, it pays off financially.
Yeah. And tell me, Kevin, what were the 3 greatest lessons you feel you've learned during your entrepreneurial career? If you had to give a couple of bullet points, perhaps in success, and then we could also do a few on failures and challenges. So what are the three principles of success that have guided you well? And what are the 3 things you've learned from obviously failure?
There are 3 factors that really dominate international business, unfortunately, a little bit more than the U.S. business. And it's an example of you and I and our friendship. There are 3 words that dominate my way of going about business in the Middle East and Asia, et cetera. Those 3 words are relationships, relationships, and relationships. When you do it, I was in Shanghai, and I was on the board of the Shanghai Expo, and I've done a lot of business in China, not recently, but it doesn't matter. You're not going to look to a contract to sue. You're not going to hire a lawyer in China or Indonesia. If you think you're going to, you're a fool. That relationship has to be important to them as well as to you. One of my mentors in Asia once said, Spencer said to me, make sure at all times in China, they need you more than you need them. You'll never forget it. Okay. But relationships, Peter, is the number 1. Okay. Number 2, lessons learned. Probably trust and verify. And I'm sorry, trust and verify. Don't be blind. I believed in him, but I didn't check it out. That's your own darn fault. That is really your problem. And you should have done a better job. Make sure you verify things and perform due diligence. And in so doing, you'll help honest people, polish their apple and do a better job with their own company. You may have some suggestions based upon your due diligence. What's the third lesson? I guess, one lesson I have that may not be shared by others is I really learned not to buy real estate outside the United States because you can't get title insurance in many places around the world. And I know that sounds like a very distinct and small issue, but a lot of assets around the world, you can't verify the title to it. And if you can't verify the title to it and or create some sort of insurance backup to it, don't bother doing it. I've said instances where I put a bid on a house in the Caribbean, but not in Trinidad and wherever. And I was told I have a deal. And I hired lawyers. I was all set going forward. And then I found out the vice president liked my house. It's just too bad. He likes your house. Oh, okay. You're out of luck. And I thank God. And it's not just the Caribbean, it's any place in the world. I thank God I didn't buy it and he suddenly liked my house. Then I was really in trouble. I would have had a financial loss. So if you can't verify the title and you can't do something to confirm it and or insure it, don't do it. Companies fine, but assets, be really careful about making sure the title is clean and clear. I think blockchain will make a difference around the world as it is implemented to help make title to assets more clear and maybe a little less destructible and personal in terms of people having an interpretation that they can't confirm.
Yes, and in sort of times of challenge and times of failure, particularly it's about getting up. Sometimes many people think that you learn more in times of stress, challenge, and failure than actually success. Like you said, you were walking on water after that big transaction, and then found yourself in that ethically.
Mr. Universe was deep in the middle of the earth.
Yes. So, what are some of the things you've learned that entrepreneurs could take away from challenge and failure? What were some of the lessons you picked up from there?
Well, let's put it this way: financials don't lie, numbers don't lie. So words can be exaggerated, but numbers don't. So I'm really a numbers guy a lot of ways. I also, if you saw me in an airport, Peter, and you said, "What's in your briefcase?" I do a lot of iPad research, but I have articles. Whenever we're investing in something, I want to learn about it. I don't want to learn. I don't want to be the complete expert of the world, but I want to make sure I learn enough about it. Like I'm studying batteries. I haven't put an investment in batteries yet. Electric cars, et cetera, but I'm learning the industry. I'm also learning about crypto. I'm just not a total believer yet. I think it's really taken a bad hit now. It's back down about 32,000 Bitcoin. I think NFTs has really slowed down. I'm always asking myself, Peter, is it a fad or is it a trend? You want to invest in trends and you do not want to be caught on the wrong side of the wave. Remember my catch the current, make the wave of fads. And NFTs, I think, is a trend, but it's gonna have some bodies on the side of the road. Some people who went into it. I think crypto is a very, very difficult area to have a sustainable investment in. It's a little bit like a chain letter to me. And I insist that if I'm investing, some people wanted to use my bio on a couple of deals. I said, I will not go into a coin without a cause. I want to know that coin, if it's associated with X, that it's doing something good for X, and that X% of the proceeds of that coin is dedicated to the wellness of X. If it's simply a coin like Dogecoin, has nothing to do with dogs. Okay, it's got a picture of a dog on it. Has nothing to do with a dog. It's a total. If anybody corrects me, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. People buy crypto, and all they're doing is buying a phenomenon. I mean, it's like a chain letter. And the initial guys in, Peter, make a lot of money, and the last guys out or lose their shirts. So, make sure there's some substance to what you're doing. And again, if it's too good to be true, it is.
Indeed. And many of us, of course, I believe many of us are the product of our mentors. And again, Bob could talk all day about Sir Adrian Cadbury and the many wonderful people he's met to become, knowledgeable in governance as he is. I've had many experiences globally. Some of them were willing mentors, and others taught me hard lessons in the school of hard knocks. And I learned that way. Who were some of your mentors at critical times in your career, and what did you take away and learn from them?
Early in my life, not having a dad, I adopted two fathers. A lot of times young people, when they lose parents, they adopt other parents. And I adopted Ed Klein and Mr. Harold Mendelson, two amazing gentlemen. And they became my models. But I got to tell you, I worked with a gentleman named Jack Clegg, who's not with us anymore, but Jack knew more he could walk a plant floor, a business floor in 2 hours. He knew it. I used to talk to him every night when I first got married. At 10 o'clock at night, we talked business, business, business. I taught him about finance. I taught him about bank loans, and he taught me about operations. And I learned more about operations from him than any other person. Then I became the youngest general counsel in the United States of a Fortune 500 company. I learned from Henry Clark, the chairman. He was a brilliant acquisition guy. And then I set up my own acquisition law firm. We just did deals, venture capital and acquisitions. And I was lucky enough to do the small deals for the big boys. And so InvestCorp became one of my clients. And Savio Tung, the CEO, and the team taught me a lot about doing business. Here's what they taught me. And then I'll tell you a cool little story. They taught me when they buy a company, at least back in those days, when the five of us founded, them, founded InvestCorp, and they got their money out of the Bahrain, 3 or 4 of the wealthiest families. When they were buying a company, they already had a vision of who they're going to sell it to. And that may change, but it was a plan. And I always believe that early in your company, you should have a vision who you're going to sell it to. You may change it, but it allows you to say yes and no to certain directions in your company. So have the long-term plan for your company. It's almost like when you have a baby, make sure you know where you hope they go to college someday. I know that sounds silly, but I really believe in that because it helps you guide you to what you do and what you don't do. And I think I shared with you a beautiful story. You remember I was a pretty poor kid. I didn't have a bedroom when I was a kid. I had a beautiful couch. My mother was very loving. I had a beautiful couch, but I had a fire escape to go and study with a flashlight when my sister wanted to stay up late to watch TV. So I had this romantic thing when I was working with InvestCorp. God, these people from Bahrain. Wow. These investors from Bahrain. And Peter, I just shared with you last week, I was in Bahrain about a month ago. I was in Saudi, several Cornellians run a lot of the funds in Saudi. It's amazing. But I'm in Bahrain and I'm sitting at dinner with Ahmed Kanu, the Al Kanu family in Bahrain. And we're talking like family. And I mentioned InvestCorp. He says, yeah, my family invested in InvestCorp. And when I left college, I was a intern at InvestCorp. And I thought to myself, wow, that's really cool. The circle of life. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it's all, having a spirituality about you of really caring about people. So believe me, I want to make sure I get that point across. The circle of life is what God allows you to accomplish through good health. I've been very fortunate that my family and I have had good health. There are many people who don't have good health. And there are many people a lot smarter than me that haven't had anything close, whatever. It's not important. We all try our best. And most of all, we take care of our families. But health is so important. But it was so cool, Peter. And I shared with you the other day when I'm in Bahrain and the Canoe family. He says, by the way, you're not going to Dubai tomorrow. You're coming to Formula One with us tomorrow. So we turned out to be the guest of the Canoe family at Formula One in Bahrain. That was sort of a very special moment for me.
Of course. It's certainly a full circle. And
Yep.
What are some of the greatest struggles that you feel entrepreneurs go through that inhibits their success? And what do you think they can do to improve upon that?
One of the greatest obstacles that entrepreneurs have are their pillar partners. I tell people, make sure you take care of the pillar partner. Make sure you take care of that significant other, whether it's a spouse or otherwise. If I tell my entrepreneurs when I interview them, 6 days a week, you're mine. You think we have a great track record because we sort of go through the motions? We outwork our competition. It's not a lot of inspiration. It's all perspiration. Okay, we outwork people. We work harder and learn learn faster. And you're going to work probably 6 days a week. On Sunday, we hope you're going to church and spending time with your family. But most of all, when that entrepreneur gets home at 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, what that pillow partner says to him about him getting home, or her, forgive my genders, about getting home late will make or break your company. If that pillow partner says, why do you work for those jerks? I don't know why you're working there. You're not getting any special reward working on Saturday. You got a problem in your company. If that pillow partner says, I love the fact that we're vesting in ownership in that company. We have a small piece of that success. You keep working hard because this is important to our future. You've got a successful company. So send the turkey at Thanksgiving in the US. That's Thanksgiving. Have the softball game in the summer and have the Christmas party or whatever religious holiday you have. And make sure as the CEO, you spend more time with the pillow partners because you see the employees every day. Make sure those pillow partners are on board with your company and with your vision. And that pillow partner is your biggest cheerleader. That's really important. I can't remember totally the question, but I can tell you I wanted to get that across because that is a big deal.
Yeah. And one final question, and then I'll put it across to Kamala. Look, do you have any key advice for the Caribbean region to galvanize a spirit of entrepreneurship and attract the brightest and best minds to look at setting up operations in the Caribbean and incentivize investment to not only come there in the short term for a tax break, but to actually choose it as a destination of choice to structure and, of course, manage their affairs, operations, and maybe some of their capital actually in the Caribbean? What would be your advice to instill that spirit of entrepreneurship and to attract real sustainable competitive advantage and investment?
I'll say this and then I'll explain it. So don't take it. Make sure you control island fever. Now, what am I talking about? My father is from Ireland. And Ireland became sort of like the Silicon Valley of Europe during 10 years ago, whatever, because they created all sorts of incentives for their brain drain, their young people leaving the country to stick around. Okay. They created little entrepreneurial funds and they created all sorts of tax breaks for companies like pharmaceuticals, Puerto Rico, Ireland, et cetera, to establish their facilities and operations in those countries. One of the brains are all over the world. There's no monopoly on brains. I don't buy that, Asians are smarter than that. Brain, good protein brains, DNA is all over the world. One of the most important things for the Caribbean is to keep their young talent in the Caribbean and not heading for the US or Europe. Create incentives, have seed funds for early stage entrepreneurs, have little incubators for people to start their own companies and help them grow those companies. Keep your young talent in country is the most important. That is the pillar and foundation of the growth of your company, and it will pay super dividends. Keep your talent and cut the brain drain. I call it island fever. People want to get away. They got, big visions of I'm going to be in New York, I'm going to be in London. Stay where you are and grow a company and help your family. And here's your incentive to do so.
Yes, and there's many jurisdictions that have successfully done that over the years. But Kamala, I'll steer it to you because now we can probably elaborate a little bit more. We've covered the practicalities and 2 great case studies on ethics, but now let's get down to what's really happening in the Caribbean itself and where we can go forward, particularly on the ethics side.
Thank you very much, Peter. And this was such a brilliant session. So Kevin, please, you're not to go anywhere because we would like to ensure that if persons have questions or so for you, hopefully we'll have a little time to address those as well.
No problem.
And Melanie, I'm going to ask you to forgive me. I'm not going to go too much into your introduction, except I'm going to share with everyone that the profiles for all of our panelists, speakers, and moderators, it's in the agenda that was sent to you this morning, so you could get the details of it. But we have some really big issues we need to discuss with Melanie as well. In fact, Peter and I had basically finalized what this panel was going to look like before this whole issue happened in the BVI. And the news took the world by storm that the premier of the BVI was in fact arrested. And when I read the affidavit that was supposed to have supported that whole case, in it spoke about some really questionable values and practices, as well as the use of structures like shell companies to be able to facilitate some of these wrongdoing. Now, these things can impact the reputation of the Caribbean really adversely. And so it's important that we also deal with it. And so I'm so grateful that Melanie chose to respond to our last minute request to help us to also address this area as part of our conference. Now, Melanie Jones is, of course, managing partner in the Barbados office of the law firm Lex Caribbean. She leads the law firm's international business group and its entrepreneurial business unit. She has founded and leads 4 of Lex sister entities: Lex Caribbean Corporate Services, Inc., Lex Corporate Services BIM Limited, both of which are licensed to conduct corporate services in the region. So Melanie, as I said, I'm begging your forgiveness. I'm not going to go too deep into your profile because it's really admirable how much you've been able to accomplish, but we do want to hear from you. And I know one of the things you wanted to address today was the whole area of that means to the board in terms of risk and liabilities. And just before I bring you on fully, Melanie, I want to say, Kevin, we do have to speak with you again, maybe put aside a whole session, because the notion of governance when nose in, hands out, that's so critical to general good governance. But you're absolutely right. When there's a crisis, and we need to know when to recognize and how to deal with it. So that's something we do need to come back to. But at this point, let's address an issue that's really impacting us in the Caribbean. And that is where the rest of the world looks at us as the possibility of having shell companies that facilitates fraud and wrongdoing, despite regulations that exist globally to prevent these types of activities and behavior. So Melanie, I would like to invite you now to take the virtual podium and share with us what are some of your thoughts in terms of what really are our duties when we sit on a board, and how do we deal with this issue? How have we in the region dealt with this issue of shell companies?
Thank you so much for that, Kamla. I really, really appreciate the invitation to join today. As you say, it is last minute, but really was an inflection point for us here in the region. The debacle that we have seen coming out of the BVI. As you know from our chats over the weekend on WhatsApp, I was hoping to cover both issues relating to the use of shell companies in that particular context, as well as issues relating to ethics for entrepreneurs as they set up companies and as they chart, their course through developing businesses. I feel so much passion for the entrepreneurship sector, and I think that the right values and ethics are fundamental to success. I fear, however, given the time allocation, that I may not be able to do that topic justice at all today. I know that the news from the BVI is so topical, so I propose to focus on that. And perhaps, we can find time to do another session in relation to the other. So, and I have to say, the content which Kevin and Peter curated for us just now was so uplifting. I wish that all the entrepreneurs I know and those that I mentor could have been in this session. And unfortunately, my content is perhaps a little less uplifting, but it is as much a part of our business ecosystem and cultural ecosystem in the Caribbean as all of the wonderful, fabulous, inspirational things that are happening in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And I just want to thank them for setting the tone and creating some beautiful energy. Now, what about shell companies? I want to define my terms before I speak. And I want to say that a shell company is not necessarily a force of darkness. For the purposes of my comments today, when I refer to shell companies generally, I'm not using the word shell as inherently pejorative. And indeed, it is not. the nature of shell companies is not intrinsically foul or evil. The problems with shell companies really arise, and the damage is done when the companies themselves are used unethically. So absent bad faith and criminal behaviors in the use of a shell company generally has the following characteristics, all of which can be seen as neutral if we put aside bad faith and criminal behavior. So these companies are generally passive. They have no true economic and logistical substance behind them. So for example, a shell company would not have a physical location where it conducts its business and employs a cadre of human capital and generally deploys itself into substantive activity. It would be a private entity, so not listed on any exchange and not otherwise publicly raising capital. It would be unregulated, and typically a shell company would be interposed between the ultimate beneficial owners of the relevant structure and the transaction or other use to which that company is being deployed. Now, in today's world of what I refer to as hyper-regulation, especially in relation to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regimes, and given that we now have a world that is moving towards mandatory registration and disclosure of beneficial ownership, the characteristics I've outlined to you above, they are neutral, and yet in today's world, they seem to somehow by themselves suggest thin, shady, dubious entities that get themselves into trouble and cause havoc. Consider, however, the entrepreneur and consider the typical startup company incorporated at a very early stage, let's call it the brilliant idea stage, before it can afford employees or operate a physical hub, acquire any assets, or actually trade. Well, that sort of a company is in fact a shell company. So I just want to make sure that it is clearly understood that when I talk about shell companies, I don't mean to be pejorative. Having said that, shell companies do become dark forces when they are abused by their principals, whether those principals are entrepreneurs or people who are operating in public life or otherwise. And since this session is intended to highlight ethical considerations, I'm going to spend the rest of my time, unfortunately, touching on the abuse of shell companies. Of course, Kamla, as you mentioned, the perfect example of the abusive deployment of shell companies exploded into our consciousness in the region very recently when we heard of the arrest in the US of the then premier of the BVI, the director of the BVI port and her son, in connection with alleged drug and money laundering related offenses. Shockingly, the transcripts of some of the conversations held among those persons and the undercover DEA agents reveal open, unabashed admissions in relation to the use of one or more shell companies to facilitate the alleged heinous behaviors. What's really sad about this to me is not the affirmation that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, because we know this. We are probably in this audience all hardened to that reality. What is desperately sad about what has happened in the BVI can be summarized in the words of Mike Wardle when he spoke earlier and told us that you can spend decades striving to build a good reputation, but you can ruin one in 5 minutes. So as a Bajan who's lived and worked in 4 different financial centers around the world, and for the last 20 years back home in Barbados, focusing on the international business sector, I am acutely aware, and I take very personally, how vitally important any country's reputation, and especially the reputation of a small island state, is to the sustainability of its economy and to the livelihood and quality of life of its people. Speaking again very personally, I'm keenly aware of the efficient generation of hard currency inflows and of the critically important corporation and personal income tax revenues that are raised in offshore or island financial centers through the international business sectors. I'm aware of the significant employment and training and development advantages arising from those sectors. And quite apart from those positive dynamics, there are palpable benefits elsewhere, most notably the economic trickle-down effect that these sectors have been using and uplifting other parts of the local business arena and society as a whole in islands like Barbados, in St. Lucia, in the BVI, in Cayman, and so on. And that's why my heart really breaks for the people of the BVI, because they're the ones who will suffer from the reputational damage that has been unleashed upon their country by the highly publicized exploitation of power and the textbook and cliched misuse of shell companies in furtherance of the alleged criminal behavior of the perpetrators. So it's against that background and with a heavy heart that I talk about whether, when we look around us today in our region, shell companies should still be subject to this kind of misuse on an indiscriminate and widespread basis throughout the region. The short answer is that today, in 2022, in theory, no, they should not. The corollary to that is that as long as we have in our territories the right infrastructure and the correct ethical underpins to support transparent and sound business, then this kind of abuse of shell companies should not proliferate. The slightly longer answer is that corrupt persons who occupy special positions of power and who can rely upon or force the cooperation of others will still be in a position to exploit shell companies for self-serving criminal purposes. The longest answer of all comprises a series of points which I'm going to share below, in expanding on my reference just now to the importance of the right infrastructure and values and ethics within our business arenas and societies. So I'm going to look very, very briefly at the following infrastructural pillars. Firstly, the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing regulatory regimes. Secondly, economic substance regimes. Thirdly, anti-corruption regimes. The rule of law generally, and the critical importance of enforcement of all of the relevant regulatory regimes. And finally, the indispensable value that is brought by independent judiciaries and by the resistance of judiciaries to corruption-backed pressure from any sector, whether public or private or otherwise. So firstly, just to look very quickly, I don't have time, of course, to get into the technical provisions of the anti-money laundering regimes, but suffice to say that in our region, in the English-speaking Caribbean, we have anti-money laundering regimes in all of the territories. We also have, to one degree or another, anti-corruption, if not regimes, we have anti-corruption legislation. And in those territories which are focused on competing in the global market for international financial services and tax and other international business-related activity, such as BVI and the Cayman Islands, the Turks and Caicos and Barbados, we also now have economic substance regimes. So all of those regimes have a critical role to play in terms of preventing the exploitation of shell companies for these critical activities. I just don't have time today to go into any depth at all, but if during question time somebody would like to ask a pointed question, I will do my best to answer. But what I will say in relation to the AML regimes is that they're the ones that have now been around the longest, because when the EU and the OECD decided to try to shut down our little island states' financial services arenas, they started with trying to get us to implement AML regimes that today are best in class. It takes you 6 weeks or 8 or 10 to open a bank account in most English-speaking Caribbean territories, and it takes you, an hour. I could go to the US with some identification and I could open a bank account in an hour. So we have these best-in-class AML regimes, and if they are properly enforced, because enforcement is just hugely important, if they are properly enforced, then AML regimes with their requirements for knowing one's client, in some regimes, it is even necessary for a business that is set up to know who it is doing business with, and it is necessary for the regulators to know who are the ultimate beneficial owners of those businesses, as well as who are the other controllers, such as directors and others. So with the know your client regimes that are built into the anti-money laundering legislation, there is a very good resource, a tool that we have to help stop shell companies being used to hide their ownership and to buffer their owners from any blowback from their illegal activities. We also have anti-corruption legislation, and I'll be very quick on this because anti-corruption legislation, it looks very pretty when somebody is researching your jurisdiction. However, if it is not enforced, then it is a waste of paper or a waste of, pixels or whatever it is. And I don't propose to go more into the conundrum around the region's anti-corruption legislation, but just to say that if someone from outside was to ask whether we see many cases before our courts and many convictions under the anti-corruption legislation, the answer to that question most definitively would be no. And so I will leave that here for now. And I will simply summarize by saying that at present, our anti-corruption legislation does not really appear to be assisting us in terms of preventing criminal behavior, including the exploitation of shell companies. In addition, we have economic substance regimes in those territories, as I said, which tend to operate international financial services sector. And those regimes have all been imposed upon us by the EU and the OECD. And they are largely of similar effect throughout the jurisdictions that have them. And what those regimes do now is they make it illegal to be conducting a certain type of activity in the jurisdiction unless there is real economic substance in the jurisdiction, which means that the activities of the business that generate income, they really need to be conducted in jurisdiction. It means that you have to have business premises, you have to have an adequate number of employees and so on. And this again is going to cause a flight to quality into the Caribbean because our economic substance regimes are best in class. They're the best in the world. We've been forced to undertake them by the EU and others who would like to shut us down. And instead of crumbling beneath the weight of that kind of bullying behavior, we have risen to the occasion, as we tend to do in the Caribbean, punching above our weight. And we have robust economic substance regimes, which, if they are properly monitored and enforced by our regulators, will go a very long way to causing a flight to quality and to substance into the jurisdiction and to marginalizing structures that have no substance, including structures which utilize shell companies in an unethical and illegal fashion. The other 2 points that I want to make, and I flagged them for you earlier, is that the rule of law is so critical to ensuring that we go into the world's markets in an ethical way with the right values. And I think that the experience with the rule of law around the English-speaking Caribbean is perhaps not identical in every jurisdiction, but generally speaking, the rule of law is upheld in our territories, which is an incredibly important and positive thing, because as I said before, no point having anti-corruption regimes if they have no real impact. But we do have anti-money laundering regimes, and we do have economic substance regimes. We do have other regulatory regimes which are upheld and respected through a belief in the rule of law. And so that is positive in terms of helping to create an environment that does not allow this kind of unethical, exploitative behavior utilizing shell companies to flourish. The only other thing that I want to mention is, of course, our judiciaries. If we have great regimes, if we uphold the rule of law, if we have right-sized regulatory bodies that have been properly upskilled and upcapacitated through governments recognizing the importance of this regulation and allocating budget so that the necessary human capital is trained and deployed in the regulatory agencies, then you have a really good recipe there to help with the problem. But if it is that enforcement requires at times the help of the courts, and the courts do not respond to that imperative in an effective fashion, or if the courts cannot be independent from temptations placed before them or pressure levied against them by the state, or worse, from corruption-related pressures, then we have some good tools, but how well are we going to be able to use them? And I'm being very straight and very open in making these comments, because I think we have to recognize that there are lots of very positive things happening in our environment, but there are obviously some opportunities for institutional and other strengthening, and that we have to make everything discussable. We have to identify where the weaknesses are. We have to recognize the opportunities, and we have to be bold enough and disciplined enough to really go after those opportunities to make our infrastructure better, to insist that ethics and values are adhered to, so that we can eradicate the kinds of behaviors that we have just seen in the BVI context, and which we have seen before in other contexts, and which we see all over the world. But of course, you know, being Caribbean people, we are focused today on what's going on in our region. So thank you so much for giving me some time to speak. It's been lovely to be with you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And I think you raised some really, really critical points there. And I love what you have said. You know, we must be able to speak about all of these issues because it's the only way we'd be able to deal with it. So I just want to pose a question to you, because I think that when we take into consideration what you have shared and add to that some of the lessons we learned from what Kevin shared earlier, you would have described really truly that the legislation stifles to a great extent, you know, the entrepreneurship in the area. But at the same time, we all know, with respect to public sector type activities as well, the length of time, the delays in getting things done. So, and Kevin spoke about the importance of relationships. I want to ask you, from your experience, if we could marry those, and is there a future for us with private partnerships, public-private partnerships, you know, where we will bring together those with the authority to be able to issue the license, but then, you know, the private sector that can demonstrate the transparency and the disclosure and the KPIs to meet targets. And so what has been your experience, and is that something can work? And then we'll ask Kevin as well if he would want to chime in with that.
Sure. So thank you for the question. I'm going to try to distill it down by giving a brief answer. I think, Kamla, that there is no way through any of the challenges that we face in the Caribbean when it comes to regulation and reputation. We cannot win on reputation and regulation in a holistic fashion and in an enduring fashion unless we have a really productive, effective public-private sector partnership. And when I left London, I went to work in Cayman for a period of time before coming home. And one of the things that blew me away in Cayman is that all of the good pieces of legislation that have brought the world's wealth into that country, especially in the context of things like the hedge fund markets, those pieces of legislation were all drafted by private sector persons who were experts in their field and understood what was required in order to bring wealth into Cayman while delivering a legitimate, well thought out, properly structured tool into the capital market industry. Now, I don't want to comment specifically on any other jurisdiction, but I will say that I am aware, because I've also worked in other places besides Barbados in the region. I'm aware that one of our difficulties at times is leveraging the expertise and the drive that comes out of the private sector and getting comfortable with the public sector harnessing that and using it to then produce, let's say, a brilliant piece of enabling legislation or a piece of regulation that has been properly sized, appropriately sized. And I think that we do have some cultural issues around public-private partnership. And we get confused sometimes about the fundamental importance of understanding that it is government who makes policy, not the private sector, government who makes policy. But the private sector, you know, must ventilate and share with government, and there must be open, everything discussable dialogue, so that when policy is made by government, it's made within the correct frame and the fullest possible context. And so I agree with you 100% that a relationship nurturing and driven culture where everybody is collaborating in an authentic way is going to be the best way forward in dealing with some of our difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Melanie. Kevin, may I ask you to unmute and to join in the conversation and share with us your thoughts in terms of how we deal with some of these challenges which Melanie raised. You're still on mute, by the way.
Melanie, I agree with what you said 100%. You know, private industry, private sector has to work with public sector, and they have to be collaborative. You know, one without the other doesn't make it at all. And you know, you have to provide incentives too, you know, unfortunately or fortunately, or however you look at it. And I think, for example, the public sector should reward private sector good citizens with economic contracts, et cetera. You know, there should be a way of saying, okay, you're playing ball with us. We're gonna favor you in some way. I don't mean any corruption, but there's got to be a way of saying we incentivize private industry, not just morally. That's important. I'm not missing the point. I'm not telling you that private sector cannot live to morality. They can and will, but also reward them so it creates a momentum inside of that society, so everybody's working in the same direction. So, you know, we talk about public-private. There's so many words people talk about and don't implement, but have each side reward those who are doing the best job of collaboration makes the most sense to me, whether it's in kind or literally in recognition. But, you know, put words into action. I always tell my kids, I tell my friends, I tell my entrepreneurs, words are so easy. And I hate to tell you, sometimes, only sometimes, legislation is easier said than, as you implied, Melanie, the implementation of that legislation. So make that collaboration rewarding to all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Kevin. Peter, I wanted to bring you in the conversation as well, because we still have 10 minutes with this session in the event that you wanted to ask any questions of Kevin or Melanie as well. You know, but I just want to say I find this has been really brilliant so far.
No, indeed. I've been taking copious notes, and I can't wait to be looking at the opportunities to focus on following this session, particularly. But no, my question is, of course, for Melanie, in particular, because in the family office world, Kevin will attest, there's foundations, there's trusts, there's structures. Again, it's par for the course. It's really, it has to be done, even if it's not necessarily just a tax incentive. It's really for financial privacy. Predators, again, they have in America the ambulance chases, and it's extraordinarily litigious. You look at states such as New York and California, and I just got literally an NDA that was a cloaked version of a non-compete agreement, and I'm sure, Kevin, you've got plenty of those sent over by entrepreneurs. And if I sign that, I'm in breach of contract immediately upon that. So targeting the wealthy, of course, is some sort of villains in the world is they're looking at a very tiny minority and demonizing those demons, so to speak, and painting the brush of all family offices, etc., and ultra wealthy individuals. But look, one thing I wanted to elaborate upon is you can elaborate a bit upon that component as well, on how they actually do due diligencing and their attitude towards legitimate wealth of true wealth holders that have earned it the proper way, as opposed to everyone's got the story of the oligarch, the money launderer, the drug dealer. That's one. And number two, from the fiduciary world, and I'm probably going back a good 5 or so years, some prominent firms here that I knew, they were telling me that there was even discussions way back of the BVI considering even independence and a complete separation from the UK. Now, do you think this present scenario and conundrum has made that more of a situation that's made it closer to the UK, or is it now separating somewhat where they're feeling they should go in that direction?
So in relation to, thank you for the question. In relation to the BVI, I will say that I cannot profess to have local knowledge. I was offered 2 jobs there once before I went to Cayman. And so I visited a few times, and I have talked to people who were then and still are now in professional services. I don't feel qualified to predict what will happen. Speaking only from an instinctive place, I suspect that the idea of culturally to a BV Islander of their own right to self-determination, such as it exists, given that they are still a British dependency, but it does exist. They have their own premier. He's a BV Islander. I think culturally, the idea that what rights to self-determination they enjoy or have enjoyed when they, under their own premier, having those eroded and taken away, and being told that somebody else is to be sort of in charge and the grip is to tighten and so on, yes, by the great Mother England, my instinct tells me that culturally that is not an attractive proposition. On the other hand, realism would require somebody who lives in the BVI to understand that the affluence that is there and the quality of life, especially through trickle down, is largely there because of 2 things. One, the yachting industry, and 2, and probably to a far greater extent, the international financial services industry. And if you want to compete today in the international financial services arena, before it was all about tax. That debate is just dead and gone. I don't even know why we talk about tax arbitrage anymore in international financial services centers. It is about right-sized regulation. It is about the rule of law. It is about getting entrepreneurs and the heads of financial institutions alike to come and hub their businesses in our region. It is about that. And so you have to balance those realities with fighting against the idea of having, the British come in and tidy things up a bit and get things back on the right track. It may be unpalatable, but you have to balance it, because if it is that you appear to prefer to just have a sort of an anarchy where people can just do what they like and self-determination is used as an excuse for bad behavior, you're not going to be able to attract credible investors. You're not going to be able to attract the right sort of investors. You will have the antithesis of a flight to quality. You will become a hallmark of where sort of bad things can happen and ethics don't really matter. And clearly that is counterproductive if you're looking at the BVI people as a whole and what is good for a sustainable economy in the long term. So we'll see, will they balance these realities, or will they simply say culturally, it's unacceptable to us to subjugate ourselves to more control from the UK and we want to be independent? It's difficult to call that.
Well, if I may share, Peter, there's some experience in the region in terms of how some countries have done it. And first, I want to underscore that being small as how BVI is does not, preclude them from still being able to focus and be extremely successful, as David shared with us earlier with respect to St. Kitts, which is a very, very small island. But what I've seen happen with the Dutch Caribbean is that part of that whole move towards self-governance, more away from the Netherlands, required certain governance codes. which in Curacao, I know was actually made into law, that there is a corporate governance code for state-owned enterprises in terms of how boards are appointed and that kind of thing. We recently heard from St. Martin, and I think they too are developing a code at the moment. So the council, the Corporate Governance Council out of St. Martin is going to be joining us at CCGI soon. So we'd learn a lot more from them as well. But clearly, the solution to a lot of these areas is having the right kinds of corporate governance principles, which are embraced, which are embodied in how we make our decisions and the things that we do.
And I would say as well, Kamla, that, you know, the insistence on proper governance, it has to become ubiquitous in our region. You know, I'm showing my age here, but I grew up in a time in Barbados where there was radio, but not television. I grew up in a time where I wrote my exams at a foreign university, you know, which I showed up at because I had a Barbados government scholarship, and I wrote my exams in pen and ink, and every single, even my dissertation was in pen and ink. You know, we live in such a rapidly changing world, and things that we didn't dream of then are now ubiquitous, including free Wi-Fi for all. You know, it's like a human right. So similarly, these levels of governance are going to have to become ubiquitous. You know, otherwise, as I mentioned before, you're going to have this race to the region by people who are racing away from quality, you know, to something else, which is dark and evil.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but you know, as both Kevin and you said, Melanie, it's not something that's just here in the region. It can happen anywhere. You know, people are people wherever they are. So we can get past this. We can resolve these kinds of issues, and we can look at a really bright future for the region. So as we come to the close of this particular panel, it's 3:28, so we have 2 more minutes. Kevin, I want to ask you, you know, what advice would you want to give us in the region in terms of if you wanted to invest here, what are some of the things that you'd be looking for? I'd loved your idea earlier in terms of, you know, ensuring that we keep our young people and support them in terms of they becoming entrepreneurs. But if you personally were looking at something in this area, what would it be?
You know, when I teach at Cornell and some other schools, I always tell my entrepreneurial students, look at the indexes of ease of doing business, whether put together by the World Bank or the Economic Forum, and look at all those categories. How easy is it to incorporate? How is it easy to do taxes, et cetera? Look at that. Caribbean should look at that as a whole and strive to have as a goal to increase its ratings. I know that sounds just like a rating thing, but it's not. And people do look at it. And I, you know, I remember I used to, I spend now a lot more time again in Saudi Arabia, but I remember the fellow who headed up Sadia saying to me, we want to be 20 by 20. And this is, you know, like 2016 or something. But, you know, some of the major economies, growing economies in the world, really respect that and look at that importantly. Second and last point, got to have teeth in what you're doing. You know, I respect everything that's been said, really respect it. And I know that everybody on this call is dealing in good faith, but do they have the ability to, you know, really do something about it? Can we put these words into action? The government has to give the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute and others the ability to do something about it, if nothing else, to expose the clear culprits, and they need to be protected by the government. But I see so much words around the world, and I don't see enough teeth. I know that's a terrible expression, but enforceability. And that's got to be done, not just by, you know, an attorney general, okay, but by good, well-meaning private sector institutes to work collaboratively with the government to take care of those bad guys and bad girls and get them out of the way.
Mm-hmm. I see Professor Garrett has unmuted, so I know that he has something that he wants to share with us. So I'll invite him to share his thoughts, Melanie, before I come to ask you for your closing comments, okay?
I totally agree with what Kevin just said. In the end, it's the lack of enforceability or lack of enforcement in many countries now, because we're getting more and more codes, we're getting more and more regulation, all that's going through, but it's not really ending up in the courts. So we're not getting the precedents that we need to actually allow all of us to understand exactly what we're meant to be doing. And that really worries me. So whether the BVI, chooses to leave its current constitution and possibly stay a member of the Commonwealth or possibly not, that's not terribly relevant, because I think what's happening in the wider world is that we, in governance terms, are facing more and more a global version of common law appearing all over the world. And it's going to be messy, it's difficult, but if you look at the Commonwealth countries, which are perhaps 60% of the global population at the moment, they all have common law in various ways. Many other countries are developing versions of common law. And my 30, 40 years experience in China is that although the Chinese would deny it, absolutely, they've been using the Hong Kong common law to develop their codes and their regulations a lot. But what we're seeing is this coming together. So, for example, we're looking at ISO 37000, which we've discussed on this forum a number of times now, as becoming not a code, but a world standard for corporate governance. We're seeing the work that Mervyn King's been doing on the dreadfully named Global Comprehensive Corporate Governance Reporting System. But again, it is absolutely a global process structure which people are beginning to sign up to. We've got common law in its slightly tacky form already, but it's quite robust. I mean, a good few hundred years of precedent behind it. So we're beginning to see these things together. The problem is the politicians don't give a damn. Certainly it's true of the UK. Only yesterday, they announced they were dropping the piece of legislation that was just about to go through in the Queen's speech on enforcing the new regulatory commission. They dropped it, full stop. No explanation, no apology. It's just dropped. It's not politically important, which has driven a load of people absolutely crazy today, including me. So, it's their short-termism is beginning to come head on to the clash of these bigger global standardizations, let's call them. And the whole thing is getting quite interesting at the moment.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Garrett. So it just requires us to constantly be on the ball, because things changes so very quickly, in terms of what we place our focus on, or how the environment itself impacts us. So Melanie, I want to invite you to give your closing remarks before I thank everyone and close off the session.